Was A Progress Through Politics, in which he contrasts the leadership of Margaret Thatcher with that of Harold Wilson, who died recently.
For 50 years I've tramped the political beat here at Westminster and around Britain, thoroughly enjoying myself. The aim of my reporting has been to provide what I call politics for grown-ups. That is, not pretending our gravest national problems have simple solutions. This programme is about the fundamental principles of how we should govern Britain, about how far theory can stand against the tide of events. For example, whether we should rely on the political flexibility of a Harold Wilson or the enamelled certainty of a Margaret Thatcher. Democratic politics is far more difficult than people understand. It's an art form which relies on debate and infinite compromise. Politicians are not saints, but nobody who mixes with them can accept that they're only in it for their own benefit. But you shouldn't believe those MPs who say their party are all heroes, their opponents all villains. Rubbish. The swing of the electoral pendulum is an essential safeguard of our liberties. Since the war, I've observed two kinds of politics. The first 30 years saw a pragmatic consensus when both major parties concentrated on solving problems. Today, Britain is emerging from 20 years of theory and dogma. I think the consensus had greater merits. In Belfast, precisely 50 years ago, I became a journalist. I had just left school and the post-war world was awakening to a new politics. People were determined not to return to the dole queues of the 30s. Belfast then had the largest shipyard in the world. Britain's full employment of the war years endured, and even black spots like Ulster were more prosperous than ever. The nation clung to its sense of common purpose. For my taste, Ulster politics cared too little about jobs and social improvements, too much for sectarian divisions. Yet this was an era of revolutionary hope, and to be young was, well, if not quite Wordsworth's very heaven, then at least exciting.
You know, it was really fun to work in newspapers in those days. I thought the Telegraph seemed to be exceptional in that there was a certain degree of free and easy atmosphere in it. It was quite the thing to read the communist newspaper and profess Labour views, because there was no Labour Party in Northern Ireland and very little Labour sympathy.
I mean, did you ever get angry with the sterility of the politics?
I tended not to get angry at things like that, except when you would express views which were outrageous. I would get a bit cross with that. But on the whole, I tended to regard it as something that was immutable, and why the hell get upset about it? Live among it, live with it, do the best you can in it.
This is about as far from Westminster as you can get within the United Kingdom, the Irish border in County Fermanagh. In the late 40s, a British Prime Minister could enjoy a holiday with his wife in the Republic and then drive back into Ulster without a policeman in sight. This was my first encounter with a leading national politician, Clement Attlee.
Prime Minister, John Cole from the Belfast Telegraph. I wonder if I could trouble you for a comment on an article that appeared in yesterday's Observer newspaper. I don't know if you've seen it.
Even then, journalists were conjuring up fantasies about removal of the border. Attlee had not seen the paper, for this was before the macho era of 52 weeks a year politics. But he took the report in at a glance and denied it point by spurious point. As I considered my first scoop, I noted that his words fell into logical paragraphs. Clearly there was a Premier League in British politics to which one day I would want to transfer. So I moved to the Manchester Guardian. There, instead of the atavistic memories which preoccupied Irish politicians, I was able to concentrate on the more universal and more significant politics of right and left. But first I wandered happily through one of the few oases in my political journey.
What a lot of the reporters did was to write not hard news stories, but what we call colour pieces about folkways, particularly north of England.
That's right. The last boatman in Windermere, as it might be.
Yeah. Last tripe-eater in West Horton or whatever. Last clog-maker in Bolton. And it was very agreeable. So you went out and did these nice stories, and you were expected to take over and write a piece in your own style, not to write a hard news piece. And what you wrote got printed. The Guardian was very much its own place. It didn't seem to me like any other newspaper I'd ever come across. And people on the Guardian certainly believe that has something to do with it being in Manchester rather than in London.
The thunder of the Guardian's presses echoed the journalistic maxims of its great founding editor, C.P. Scott. Facts are sacred, but comment is free. The voice of opponents as well as of friends must be heard. It is good to be frank, it is better to be fair.
When I came here, C.P. Scott was still the principal character in the drama, really, even though he'd been dead for a number of years. The whole place was alive with his mythology, and I think his philosophy still informed it. But I suppose that that kind of north of England dissenting tradition was at the heart of the Guardian's philosophy, wasn't it?
That tradition of reasoned argument and dissent marked us all for life. My job as Labour correspondent spanned industry and politics. All parties then believed in a pluralist society. Trade unions are a vital part of that.
All those in favour, please show.
For all the lunacies which have reduced their influence in the past 2 decades, I believe unions remain working people's only sure protection and a bulwark of democracy. The TUC's obligation to work with governments of any political colour was the constant message of George Woodcock, a man of Socratic mind.
All through my time at the TUC has been trying as hard as we possibly can to have an influence upon government. We do deal with people who have power given to them by the electorate of this country.
My shrewdest political tutor was Harold Wilson, who died recently. He believed in the politics of persuasion, although he could be combative.
It has been called the irresponsible society. The society where money counts more than men, where profit counts more than service, where making money...
Nonetheless, once in Downing Street, he displayed an instinct for compromise. This was an instinct shared by One Nation Tories as well in those years of consensus. Some younger Labour men worried about Wilson's pragmatism, though it did not represent the value-free politics they feared.
Harold Wilson was a much better Prime Minister than we thought him at the time. I don't know how much economics he knew. He wasn't at all interested in political philosophy, political ideas. There's a downside to that as well as an advantage. And the downside is you could only pinpoint 2 or 3 things that Harold Wilson believed in with passion.
He once said to me that he believed in pragmatism because all politics was inevitably pragmatic, that the people supported him not as an ideologue, but as a man who was a good manager, who would look after the shop while they got on with their lives. And I think he did that, but he did it within the kind of purview of your party. He was pushing in the same direction, surely, as people like yourself.
What Harold really believed in was a society in which ability succeeded irrespective of your background. That's why he says that his great achievement was the Open University. because the Open University was a way in which young men and women who hadn't had a formal chance could make it if they were clever enough. That's what Harold Wilson really stood for.
I'm not going to make another speech.
He had the instinct of equality, he had the instinct of approachability, likability, the instinct of common sense. You know, you used your common sense, and you used your wits, and you worked hard. There was a lot in there to hold the affection of the party, whatever mistakes he made, and he made quite a lot of mistakes.
The holy grail of post-war politics for both Tories and Labour was growth without inflation. The means was voluntary incomes policy. As a pragmatist, Harold Wilson believed in that.
Because if incomes run ahead of production, it will follow, as night follows day, that the only result will be higher prices and no lasting improvement in living standards.
The danger for union members was that if they didn't help fight inflation, governments would inevitably abandon the historic commitment to full employment. To keep economic growth going, an incomes policy seemed essential.
I remember, were one of the first to tell me we should have one. In that famous pub in Blackpool, in
Yates's Wine Lodge.
Yates's Wine Lodge, when we were drinking champagne at £0.50 a glass, and you told me then, as I was a putative chancellor in 1963, you see your own sins come back on your head, that I must have a voluntary incomes policy.
Well, have you regretted it?
No, I don't. I think that the trade unions failed to see the importance and the advantage of it. It wasn't that their leaders didn't see it. Their leaders saw it, but they were not strong enough and not willing to take a lead against the more very left-wing activists who at that time had climbed into positions of authority in their union, even though the ordinary trade union member, their own member, saw it and was ready to go along with a voluntary incomes policy.
Voluntary was the key word. The previous Tory Chancellor, Reginald Maudling, had understood this instinctively, but many less wise politicians are tempted to rig the labour market either through unemployment or through statute. I was sure they were mistaken.
The implication of our system in this country, of collective bargaining, of work people on their side, choosing freely for themselves their form of organisation, this is the principle that has been long established in this country, and it is wrong, and certainly extremely dangerous even to attempt to interfere with unions in this bargaining process.
All TUC leaders must reconcile national economic aims with their members' individual interests.
It's one of the great problems. How do you get together at the same time? The idea of full employment, the idea of stable prices, the idea of freedom of bargaining, just those three.
George Brown, Wilson's turbulent deputy, engineered a deal on pay. His department had not only to talk with employers and unions, but to worry also about pressure on sterling from the currency markets. Ministers were eventually forced to abandon voluntary pay policy by the gnomes of Zurich, who knew nothing about labour relations. Before that happened, George Brown had won a voluntary deal, which for a time inspired great hopes.
I remember a great argument between George Wilcock and Brown over this issue, with Wilson on the end of a telephone in the Isles of Scilly, where they were seeking far too much, so that eventually it was Wilson in that situation who said, "Okay, I'll settle for that," as distinct from Brown, who was demanding a great deal more. So there Wilson was a moderating influence, quite frankly.
To the family, my continuing interest in this subject must have seemed like an obsession. But this was central to Britain's problems and to the persuasive politics in which I believed. Wilson's enthusiasm for it was part of his flexible approach. But it was over Europe, the great divisive issue of the end of century, that he showed his suppleness most. He became convinced that common market membership would best serve British interests. Labour tried to gain entry in the 60s without success. When the Tories did succeed in 1973, both parties split. Wilson's problem was how to achieve his European objective while restoring party unity. Back in government, this supreme party manager finessed his way round a political minefield. He seized on the left's demands for a referendum and let ministers campaign on both sides.
I believe the Labour Party will come out of this referendum not weaker but stronger. But it is important not only for ministers but all participants in all parties that this agreement to differ is qualified by restraint and self-discipline and the avoidance of personalities.
The left went its own way. Wilson told me he could not have held together a credible Labour cabinet without allowing ministers this freedom.
Higher in Brussels than they are here. The British food basket, which you see here, cost £4.24, and the
prices might catch the headlines, but Europe was a more profoundly divisive issue than that for both main parties.
I often think of Harold when we look at poor John Major's flounderings over Europe. He's getting to some extent the same attacks, you know, as he's not taking a strong enough, bold enough stand on principle. Either way. But I remember, well, Harold bided his time. And in the end, he got the result he wanted because he'd been long a convert to the view that Britain ought to be in the European community. He believed that the only way he could hold his unruly troops together, the right and the left, and somehow keep a government on the road, was by coming. He said, I have always seen it as my duty, my overriding duty, to hold this party together. And it was a principle with him. And he sacrificed a great deal of his reputation, to say nothing of his health, to supporting that principle, because of course it could mean that he was attacked by both sides.
I think that he paid a great price for his European wobbles. I remember telling him that quite strongly at the time. He's taking it quite well, even though I put it in terms he might have been offended about, saying, people admire a lot of your talents, but you have a reputation for trickiness, if you like. And I'm sure it would be in your own benefit to stand up and face an issue and fight it through like this. Even if you lost at one conference, you'd still come out of it stronger at the end, and you'd still be more likely to have your tit-for-tat with Teddy Heath and come back as Prime Minister afterwards. He didn't argue with me. He said, yes, there's a lot in that. I'll think about it very carefully. Though somehow I knew that he was going to come out with the wrong answer when he'd thought about it very carefully.
But he put party unity first.
I always recall Harold getting very fed up with some of his critics in the cabinet over this at one cabinet meeting, and said it was all right for them, they had kept their souls clean, and as for him, he'd had to wade through shit on their account.
Harold Wilson won 4 elections out of the 5 he fought. His political achievement was to inch Britain towards a more just society in which the have-nots would enjoy a better chance.
First of all, I'd like to thank Councillor Mrs. Pattison for letting us visit their home, and also for letting...
The one election he lost in 1970 may have lessons for Tony Blair.
The people who advised us about the media said the best course for maximising your vote is to be reassuring. The word reassuring very often dominates Labour Party strategic discussions. Be reassuring. And my judgment, my guess is that the advice then was reassurance was needed above all other things. Reassurance rather than excitement. It's always a great choice Labour parties have to make. Then we made the wrong choice and avoided excitement altogether.
Harold Wilson took quiet pride in achieving improvement in people's health, welfare and pensions. in help for the Third World, and in creating the Open University. His was a commonsensical rather than a revolutionary agenda. Events since his long illness leave the wistful thought that he may have been wiser than hostile critics realised. In Ulster, the political debate was starker, less philosophical than arguments about ideology and pragmatism. There, the issue was the ancient, bloody one of nationality. When I went back to the village where Attlee crossed the border, it was guarded by a fortified police station. I went to London because I was fascinated by national politics and frustrated by the Ulster variety. But few of us ever cut the silver cord that binds us to the place of our birth. When I left Belfast in 1956, its public life seemed boringly repetitive. Often in the past quarter century, the people who live here would have welcomed a resurgence of that boredom. It would have been better for them than the equally repetitive but deadly alternative, what Sean O'Casey called the hate, the murdering hate. That hate comes from small minorities in both communities whose reverence for democracy has never matched their fanatical belief in their own rightness. Terrorism is what makes Ulster politics unique. But I kept looking for a political solution. The province must remain part of Britain because that's what most people there want. But disagreement on this border issue must not exclude nationalists from a share in government. From the summer of 1969, I argued for power sharing. In the years before Whitehall adopted this, the bombing and destruction went on. Terrorism, whether Republican or Loyalist, held an effective veto on political progress. Finally, in 1973, Willie Whitelaw launched what I still regard as the last best hope of a political settlement, the power-sharing executive. Its Catholic deputy chief was Jerry Fitt.
Willie Whitelaw was, I think it would be fair to say, he was very emotional about it. He said, well, gentlemen, he said, I never believed when I came here that we would ever see a power-sharing executive set up. And tears were not very far from his eyes. And as I say, it was a great emotional moment for me, because given my socialist and Labour background, I was delighted to see something which would encompass Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. And when I saw Willie Whitelaw on the verge of tears, I then began to cry too. And I looked over on Brian Faulkner, who was regarded as being a hard unionist orange man, etc. He was on the verge of tears as well. And we all got up, or the three of us got up, Brian Faulkner and myself, and we went over and we shook hands with Willie Whitelaw, who was then as Secretary of State. And looking back on it now, I think that those three handshakes were by far more important than the handshakes we have seen on television within recent days.
Looking back through recent attempts to solve the Ulster question, it is Protestant anger about involvement of the Irish government which has shipwrecked the plans. Through the Downing Street Declaration and the Anglo-Irish Agreement, right back to 1974 when power sharing collapsed for just that reason after the British government negotiated an agreement with Dublin at Sunningdale.
And I realised that the question of a Council of Ireland, as it was then being discussed, could in effect kill off, as it did, the Sunningdale executive. And now, 21 years after it, I think they are going to make the same mistake.
The accidentally burnt-out chamber at Stormont is sadly symbolic. The dilemma is not easy. How can two peoples with conflicting national loyalties live together and govern their lives jointly and fairly? And what hope has democratic consent in the shadow of the gunman? Back in London, as I moved to the Observer, both parties were on ideological trips, to adapt the drug patois of that age. Margaret Thatcher and Tony Benn were seeking more clear blue water between their parties. I heard Conservatives curse John Maynard Keynes and proclaim the unfailing wisdom of free markets. And I watched Labour split. We recorded the left's attempts to make it more socialist and anti-Europe. But Labour's right, accustomed to being in control, didn't like the revolution. In those Observer years of mine, the political world turned upside down. This was the watershed in modern politics. Both Labour and Conservative parties jettisoned the ideas and values they had held in common since the dark days of the war. This watershed left the opposition an unelectable rump and gave the Conservatives a monopoly of power for 2 decades. This was an historic turning point as unhappy politicians wondered whether party loyalty was any longer their supreme guide.
Well, I think you've got to go back to 71, really, because when Labour members of Parliament voted against a 3-line whip to give Heath his majority to take us into the European community, that was when the break began. And I noted in my diary at the time there are a substantial number of Labour MPs who care more about an integrated Europe than they do about the Labour Party. And indeed, I think many of them really saw Europe as a way of stopping socialism from developing in Britain.
The Limehouse Four formed their own party, making James Callaghan's Labour government look like the final flowering of the post-war consensus.
I think you have the choice between being reasonably true to yourself or being, or just saying party politics is everything. The party's a tabernacle, a sacred tabernacle. I must remain in it at all costs. And that is not my position, never has been. I think parties get above themselves and can be given too much power and too much importance. And that was one of the things which went wrong with British politics in the 70s.
On the Tory side, as far back as 1970, Edward Heath began with a strong ideological tinge. But when prices and unemployment rose, he returned to the policies of the post-war consensus. Even future Thatcherites went along with that.
We invented words like consensus as an excuse for not doing what we felt should be done. And we invented phrases like the mixed economy to try to suggest that really you could have a mix of socialism and capitalism and you'd get something out of it.
We didn't want to get back to that situation of the interwar years, the 20s and the 30s, in which unemployment was very high indeed and people suffered immensely. Now later on came a generation which hadn't experienced the 20s and the 30s and who, with the assistance of dogma, said, of course, we must follow the dogma no matter what the results are.
I call the Conservative Party now to a crusade, not merely to put a temporary brake on socialism, but to stop its onward march once and for all.
When Margaret Thatcher reached Downing Street, revolution reached Whitehall. Conviction politics took over from pragmatism. The unblinking certainty of the ideologues replaced persuasion.
We said we need changes in Britain. We need changes in our trade union structure. We need changes in the way we run our nationalized industries, changes in our tax structure. We need to have sound money. And if we have these things, then in due course we'll have a much better Britain than if we carry on the present basis.
The immediate consequences of these policies, especially of high interest rates and an overvalued pound, were devastating. Businesses went bankrupt, jobs were lost. Many of the new service jobs were low-paid, part-time, or both. Manufacturing suffered savagely.
I think once you lose your manufacturing base, it is an awful job to try and get it back again. Actually, at the moment, I think we're doing quite well, but it'll take 20 years to get a proper manufacturing base back again.
If we're to compete in a world where low-cost producers are now producing the bulk goods that they are in other parts of the world,
we have to move up market. That's why education is so important. Jim Callaghan saw that well enough. Jim tried to articulate and start the great debate on education in the late 1970s. But it faltered. I think that we didn't pick it up quickly enough. It was only in the second half of the 1980s that we really began addressing ourselves to this, and there's still a long way to go.
But Geoffrey, Conservatives used to be concerned with the condition of the people. You say James Callaghan raised this issue in 1976. We're now in 1995, and there have been a consistent level of unemployment of between 2.5 and 3 million during 15 years of your governments. I mean, surely this is the most important thing. People should have a job, should they not?
But John, nobody would disagree with that. But you speak as though you're denouncing us for a condition which we have created.
Well, I'm really surprised by the complacency that this is that employment is a residual. I mean, what's this great success that you've tamed the trade unions, that you created high unemployment, and surprise, surprise, that they don't ask for big wage increases?
John, forgive me, you put it in the most crude and imperceptive fashion. I hate unemployment. I was brought up as a young man in South Wales with figures of high unemployment as part of the backdrop. But to say one hates it and to say one would like to change it is not to solve the problem. I come back to the point that every European economy has been facing unemployment on the same scale and growing and still higher than ourselves. Now that isn't because of some wicked mischief-making capacity of Margaret Thatcher and myself. It's because we're going through a huge structural change and a changing world economy.
Since Churchill's time, full employment has been recognised as a primary function of government. When jobs became scarce in 1981, riots erupted. Without full employment, the welfare state cannot be sustained, as its architect William Beveridge warned us 50 years ago. Suddenly, the cohesion of Mrs. Thatcher's government was at risk.
And of course the cabinet was pretty upset in many different ways. Things were not going at all well, almost in any field. And yet, in the end, she and Geoffrey were determined to go through with it. I believe that we had to take the hard knock, which we did take, and we got away with it.
I'm interested in this answer because, I mean, I know that from your whole background politically and in every other way, this size of unemployment that started then and persisted for many years, even to an extent to the present time, must have been a great anguish to you. Did you feel that your loyalty to the Prime Minister and the need to sustain a cabinet rather than let the other party in was the higher duty, higher than the duty to the unemployed, for example?
I think once you put your hand on the particular policy and you follow your leader in that moment, then you've got to stick with it. You can try and get a change here and a change there, but you've got to take the principle once you have done it. And I do believe, very strongly indeed, that loyalty to a leader and the cohesion of a government and the cohesion of any party in Parliament is an enormously important factor. Though I may have had my anxieties, I suspect that she did too. Nevertheless, yes, I backed it right through.
Despite cabinet revolts over public spending, the lady was not for turning. Pure market economics and theories of money supply replaced more familiar Tory icons. Her lectures on monetarism infuriated some ministers.
Once or twice I shouted out, I couldn't care about sound money. Let's have some sensible policies for employment. And so, but I think Margaret was always torn between more doctrinal advice and views she took about how to get things right. And at the same time, she was genuinely worried at that stage about the level of unemployment. She got over it when she won the election, I think.
She used the ultimate and dangerous deterrent.
She decided she had to change the balance of the cabinet, and she chucked 2 or 3 out, pushed me to Northern Ireland.
Of course, when you get rid of a lot of ministers, they do tend to pile up behind you and not always in a very good frame of mind. She had a bit of that, and we're getting that a bit now. So there are dangers, and I don't think a Prime Minister does or should shuffle too often. She was always looking for some first principle to justify the action she was going to take.
The principle didn't come first, necessarily.
It didn't come first necessarily. Sometimes it did, but sometimes there was a certain casting around for the principle. Yes. But she was not happy till she'd found it.
Really? She
No,
didn't believe
she wasn't happy to act simply empirically.
Just a quarter of a century after leaving Belfast, I left newspaper politics behind and devoted myself to the national variety full-time for the BBC. The Palace of Westminster is a whispering village. If you keep your ear assiduously to the ground, you can sometimes make out what's going on. Democratic politics depend on reason, on persuading people. Terrorism has a darker agenda which depends on killing people.
You hear about these atrocities, these bombs. You don't expect them to happen to you. But life must go on as usual.
And your conference will go on.
The conference will go on. The conference, all right, John, the conference will go on as usual.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
Thank you.
As messages of sympathy came from opposition parties, I felt that all the Democrats were on the same side. The IRA atrocity brought out the best in Margaret Thatcher. She was not only brave and calm in face of danger, she also demonstrated in that early morning interview and at her party's grief-stricken conference later in the day her dedication to democratic values. She was always reluctant to appear to be pushed off course. But as time passed, Margaret Thatcher's popularity faded. As she stuck dogmatically to policies that were no longer producing results in living standards, secure jobs or public services, she relied more on her Downing Street team. Legends of her stubbornness flowed steadily from the cabinet room. It was her personal baby, the poll tax, which provoked electoral panic among Tory MPs.
You remember that Bismarck said that politics is the art of the possible. Mrs. Thatcher thought Bismarck was a wet. So far as she was concerned, politics is the art of making possible that which is thought to be impossible, which I can tell you is extremely wearing.
I saw the opportunity in something she said to ask ever so respectfully, will this be your last election?
Oh, that was asking for it, wasn't it?
Well,
Yeah.
it was. So she said, no, I'm going on and on and on. I read in Kenneth Baker's memoirs later that she regretted this statement.
I mean, I wouldn't accuse Mrs. Thatcher of being fully endowed with tact. And, you know, I mean, these occasional remarks used to come out, and they did, I think, cause a certain amount of trouble.
What finally undermined her was a long-running quarrel with her two most senior ministers over the linked problems of the economy and Europe. For a century and more, Britain's place in the world has been debated here in the Foreign Office. And in both main political parties in the past 30 years, Europe has become the most divisive issue in domestic politics. Harold Wilson contrived to hold the Labour Party together and to keep Britain inside Europe, but at some cost to his political reputation. On the Conservative side, not only is John Major facing constant anguish, but he can't forget that the career and the government of his predecessor, Margaret Thatcher, was destroyed by Europe. In 1989, before the Madrid summit, Foreign Secretary Howe and Chancellor Lawson threatened to resign. She was furious and determined to break up an alliance which challenged her absolute control of policy. During the reshuffle, I learned an astonishing fact. In removing Geoffrey Howe from the Foreign Office, she had invited him to be either Leader of the Commons or Home Secretary, without telling the current Home Secretary, Douglas Hurd.
In one of the most dramatic political developments of recent...
The Prime Minister has reshuffled her cabinet.
Biggest government reshuffle of her decade in power.
And he had no idea this morning of this impending change, nor did any of us. But the really intriguing bit that still remains, Nick, is the position of two people, Sir Geoffrey Howe and John Major.
Westminster still reverberating from the shock of Sir Geoffrey Howe's departure.
I now understand that he was first offered another post. That was not the end of the story. John Major's meteoric rise began when he was plucked from being number 2 at the Treasury and made Foreign Secretary, as he recognised that really made him Reserve Chancellor. Her row with Nigel Lawson over exchange rates was now irreconcilable. He even told the Queen he was finding Margaret Thatcher impossible to work with.
She'd retreated into a Downing Street bunker to a considerable extent. But she did also, I think perhaps more than most, begin to come to feel herself to be self-sufficient, to not need the colleagues, and to be careless of the colleagues' views, careless of any opposition, believing, whether it's from the colleagues or from any other quarter, that she could, by sheer strength of will, just ride over it. And that caused her all sorts of difficulties. I think that the nation began to feel that she was too strident and too hectoring.
Nigel Lawson's resignation was a near mortal blow, for he had been one of the intellectual founts of Thatcherism. But he allowed his economic ideas to be influenced by his experience as Chancellor and by world events. Mr. Lawson is a proud man, and he'd had too much. It's quite clear that he couldn't take any more of surrounding waters. In Geoffrey Howe's 15 months as her nominal deputy, their relations grew worse. He never forgave her for depriving him of the job he loved. Colleagues complained she treated him shamefully in cabinet. His resignation came when she again took a line hostile to Europe.
I've done what I believe to be right to my party and my country. The time has come for others to consider their own response to the tragic conflict of loyalties with which I have myself wrestled for perhaps too long.
I am persuaded that I now have a better prospect than Mrs. Thatcher of leading the Conservatives to a
Mrs. Thatcher has got 204 votes. Michael Heseltine has got 152 votes. That means that...
I think that's a sensational result. I think Mrs. Thatcher's future is now in the grave ballot.
So I confirm it is my intention to let my name go forward for the second ballot.
The Cabinet thought otherwise.
It's just been announced from Downing Street that Mrs. Thatcher is to resign as Prime Minister. She told the Cabinet at a meeting a short time ago.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11 and a half wonderful years.
She had been Prime Minister longer than anyone this century. The erosion of time affects all political leaders. In the slow decline and harsh fall of Margaret Thatcher, she emerges as a classical tragic heroine, a monumental figure in modern politics, brought down by fatal flaws in her own character. Notably a growing conviction that she was always right.
As regards the difference with Mrs. Thatcher, well, it's very basic. I believed in trying to secure a consensus, but at the same time giving a clear lead. She, I suppose, believed that it didn't matter a damn whether there was a consensus in the country. I preferred to try to lead the nation rather than dragoon it.
Was 1990 the sunset of Britain's experiment with ideological politics? Labour has continued its long retreat from left-wing policies. John Major combines a new tone with ostentatious preservation of his Thatcherite legacy, but he seems most concerned to preserve his party's unity, just like Harold Wilson. So is the revolution really over?
both our main political parties have moved quite sharply to the centre in the last 4 years. Of course, they each has its traditions, but the ideologies, a set of ideas, has certainly moved together. So you now have in my party people saying, well, Mr. Blair's clambered aboard our boat, we've got to find another boat, which seems to be a lunatic method of proceeding, if it's the best boat. You stay aboard and repel borders. But I don't think that parties are actually bound by ideology. I don't think many people in this country want a sort of permanent revolution or want everything, every form of public service privatized. No. And I think I personally think we're one or two more things to do, but I think we're reasonably close to that limit, and I think that would be the view of the people as a whole.
Yet in the years I've been observing Westminster, the nature of the House has changed. Ideology has left its mark. Candidates are often selected for their dogmatic purity. They are less willing to admit that opponents have an arguable point of view. Pure MPs arrive with a simple commitment to their party's ideals and wait for experience to teach them all the rest. Honest doubt, it seems, is right out of fashion.
His predecessor in standing at that smash box and replying to Mr. Jacques Delors, no, figures are wrong.
Elder statesmen are concerned.
They are so sure they are right. Well, I've never been sure in my political career that I was right. I thought it was the best thing I could do at the time, but I never was prepared to say to myself, my goodness me, I know I'm right whatever happens. Nor that I wouldn't change it if indeed it seemed necessary to do so.
Thatcherism reacted against the drift of all post-war governments, but it didn't deliver quite what people expected.
I think the rich did become considerably richer, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That may be a necessary part of a capitalist society. But I'm not certain that we looked after the 25% at the bottom end of the scale as well as we should have done.
2 decades of dogmatic politics on both left and right have not created a nation at ease with itself. The subtle structure of pluralist democracy in local government, in industry, has been shattered. In ways we are more efficient, though at a price of greater insecurity and a more selfish society. But perhaps the old consensus is about to fight back.
You can only govern Britain from the centre, and I think if you try and govern Britain from the right, it'll end up in tears and should end in tears, just as I don't agree it should be governed from the left either. The centre ground is where most of the British people are. They want sensible, pragmatic, down-to-earth policies and to have confidence in their ministers.
Inevitably, towards the end of a lifetime spent reporting politics, I asked myself whether it's all been worthwhile. Personally, I've had a fascinating life, meeting a host of able, occasionally wise, usually kind, and often amusing people, and I hope I've helped to enlighten the public too. But my opening question remains, which style of government has served the British people better? The flexibility of both Conservative and Labour leaders in the post-war years had its weaknesses, but at least they kept the nation together. Dogma, by contrast, has divided us, has made the poor poorer and left more people without jobs. In my judgment, the new tendency for politicians to rely more on their own common sense is not before its time.
Now, imagine if you could wipe